Good evening, and welcome to the May 2023 virtual meeting of the Historical Society of St. Catharines. Before we introduce this evening's speaker, I have just a few things I'd like to say. First of all, I'm Dennis Gannon, and I'm the new president of this Historical Society. I want to begin the evening by thanking our past president, Dave Willer, for his service to the Society as president for the past 6 years. He has done quite a good job in steering us through a complicated period of our existence, a time when, like everybody else, this society had to cope with the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Meetings already planned had to be canceled. Decisions had to be made about how to go on without our usual in-person meetings. We had to begin navigating cyberspace with our new virtual meetings, and now, post-pandemic, plans are being made about how to go back to those in-person meetings without giving up on the virtual meetings that we have been so pleased with. That is what the Society under Dave Willer has had to deal with, and we thank Dave for his leadership through this time. We also want to express our appreciation to persons who served on our outgoing Historical Society board for their contributions to the Society. Here I'm thinking of Nancy Cameron, Des Corin, Elizabeth Finney, Chris Lote, and Pat Richardson. We would welcome your return to our board whenever your schedules allow. Thanks to you all. And now let us continue with tonight's meeting. Here to introduce our speaker is our friend and former Historical Society president himself and retired professor of history at Brock University, Wes Turner. Wes, you're on.
Thank you, Dennis, and congratulations on becoming the new president of this society. Now, David Siegel, it's my pleasure to introduce him. He has an MA in public administration from Carleton University, a PhD in political science from the University of Toronto. He is retired from Brock. He's a professor emeritus of political science from Brock University. And during his time there, he held various administrative positions, such as associate vice president, dean of 2 faculties, and chair of his department. He was also the founding director of the Niagara Community Observatory. He has written extensively in the areas of public administration and local government. In retirement, he keeps busy. He is president of the Brock University Retirees Association, and he's on the program committee of Lifelong Learning Niagara. And he has written on the history of baseball. So I'll give you David Siegel telling us about Niagara's gentleman politician, the life and times of Robert Welch.
Thanks very much, Wes. I appreciate that introduction. Thanks to the Historical Society for asking me to come and make this presentation. And I think Wes and I think Gail Benjafield had something to do with that. So I want to thank everybody for giving me this opportunity to make this presentation. And I really enjoyed doing the work, getting ready for this presentation, because I knew Bob Welch, and like I think everybody who ever met Bob Welch really enjoyed his company and had wonderful experiences with him. And that's one reason why I enjoy doing this. But the other thing is that he really made a significant contribution to the province of Ontario, to Ontario public administration. And I'm not sure that that is fully realized, and I wanted to document some of that. So this was a real pleasure to do this kind of research, to get this information. I thank the Historical Society, so I want to thank a few other people. His children, Rob Welch, Beth Curley, and Mary Jane Matei, were very helpful to me in doing this research. They gave of their time to talk to me and to answer my questions. And I also got some excellent information from the Archives and Special Collections in the Brock University Library and from Special Collections in the St. Catharines Library. I'm going to talk, today's talk is going to be in 3 sections. I'm going to begin by basically just telling Bob Welch's life story. And then I'm here under false pretenses. I'm not really trained in history. I'm a political scientist. So I had to write about his political philosophy as well. And then I'm going to say a bit about the lasting legacy that he has left. So let's start with his life story. And he was born in St. Catharines, July 13th, 1928. So he was a year old when the Depression started. He was, his entire childhood was marked by the Depression. His parents, J. Robert Welch, seemed to have had regular employment throughout the Depression, which is a bit, it was very good, obviously. And the J. Robert and Edna Babe, everybody called her Babe, I understand, also operated a restaurant. It's the diner, which is still there at the corner of Geneva and Welland. They operated that for a number of years. And I take it with both parents working and working pretty hard, that he had a comfortable childhood for the Depression. They certainly weren't wealthy, but they as a family probably didn't suffer as much as other people might have during the Depression. He graduated from St. Catherine's Collegiate in 1946, and he was showing his interest in political activity even then because he was student council president in his last year there. He also won the Lions Club, his oratorical contest. And this must have been a very sweet event for him because he, growing up when he was younger, he had a significant speech impediment. He had a stutter, I believe, and he dealt with that by just buckling down and deciding that he was going to learn to be a public speaker and an orator. And this is something that lasted for him for his entire life. I have read about, and I've had people who served in the legislature with him tell me that they would always go to the legislature when they knew that he was speaking because he had a reputation. Of course, everybody who serves in the provincial legislature, the federal parliament, they're all excellent orators in their own mind anyway. And even these people recognized that Bob Welch was a superior orator, and they made a point of showing up in the House when he was speaking. After the collegiate, he went to McMaster and was in the arts program. He was a bit undecided at some points about whether he wanted to go into law, teaching, or into the ministry because he was quite religious. And one of the things that he used to conquer his speech impediment was he became a very good speaker in terms of the church as well, and he was invited to speak in a variety of different places. So he graduated from McMaster in 1949. He and Bob Nixon were good friends at McMaster. And this is Bob Nixon, whose father, Harry, was for a short time the Premier of Ontario, the Liberal Premier of Ontario, I should say. And Bob, of course, went on to serve for a number of years as the leader of the Ontario Liberal Party. And Bob said, and I managed to talk to Bob. He's living in an assisted living facility now, but he's very sharp. He said he couldn't figure out exactly what Bob Welch's politics were, but they had a good time together. And he was involved in student government there, as he was at the collegiate. He went on to Osgoode Hall, graduated in 1953, and he was also the student body president at Osgoode Hall. 1953 was a pretty big year for young Bob Welch. He married Rita Boston. I'm going to talk about her quite a bit later on. He graduated from Osgoode Hall, as I said. He began his law career in St. Catharines, and he was appointed to his first public service position. The municipal council appointed him to the St. Catharines Recreation Commission. I don't know exactly what the Recreation Commission did, although, any more than I can infer from the title. But the point is that he got involved in public life very quickly. Rita Boston was his lifelong companion, and they were very close, and she had a significant influence on him. She moved to St. Catharines with her mother from Verdun, Montreal. And they moved to St. Catharines when her father died because they had some sort of family support in St. Catharines that they would not have had in Verdun. She worked as a stenographer for a rail company of some kind in St. Catharines. And they met while they were both teaching Sunday school at Grace Anglican Church. They married in 1953, and they had 3 children, as I mentioned. She stopped working as a stenographer when she got married or when the children came along, but she was a very active volunteer throughout her entire life. And one bit of volunteering that really stuck with her and had a great impact on her was that she volunteered at a nursery school for children with intellectual disabilities. And that really had an impact on her. And it seems like it had an impact on that she carried that over to Bob, to an influence on Bob as well. And it gave her a lifelong concern about marginalized groups, people with intellectual disabilities. She was also very concerned about Indigenous groups. Now, remember, this is the 1950s, 1960s, when the plight of Indigenous people was really not on anybody's radar very much. I mean, we still had residential schools at that point. And the plight of Indigenous people was really not on most people's radar at that point, but it was for her. She was interested in marginalized groups. Bob's political career, he was a member of the Recreation Commission for 2 years. He went on to get elected to the St. Catharines Board of Education for 8 years. He served as chair of the board 3 times. Now, the chair of the boards of education at that time, and still, are elected by the members of the board. And particularly at that time, being chair of the board was kind of an honorific thing that was passed around among the members. So the idea that they elected him as chair 3 years, particularly 2 years in a row, the newspapers commented that this was a real vote of confidence in him, because that's not the way it was done. You usually did it 1 year and then it got passed around to somebody else. He was a member of Parliament for 22 years. He was appointed to cabinet 3 years after he was first elected, and he was a member of cabinet for 19 years. So let's talk a bit about where he fits in. We talk about the Ontario, the Progressive Conservative dynasty. It started in 1943 with George Drew. Leslie Frost became leader in 1949. Robarts 61, Davis 71, and then Frank Miller was the last leader of that the dynasty age of the Progressive Conservatives. And so I wanted you to see where Welch fits in with this? Welsh overlaps almost exactly with the Robarts and Davis years. Robarts became premier in 61. The first election he fought was 63, which was the election that put Bob Welch in the legislature. So Welsh fit just about exactly with the Robarts and Davis time. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what was going on during this time, particularly in the time when we were moving from Leslie Frost to John Robarts. Leslie Frost, in a very significant way, set the tone for the PC dynasty. I mean, George Drew was the first member, but it was really Frost who established what was called the 22 points that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And he set what was called the Red Tory agenda of the dynasty. The legislature at this time was very much rural dominated, very personal style of government, pretty unsophisticated. Leslie Frost's nickname was Old Man Ontario. He was a lawyer from Lindsay. He talked a lot about, he got a lot of information from his barber about how to run the government and so forth. And it was just that kind of system of governing. John Robarts took over in 1961. His nickname was Chairman of the Board. He was also a lawyer, but a rather different kind of lawyer with significant business connections. He's from London. He had good connections in London. He also had good connections in Toronto. He was very much a businessman. And he recognized that he was dealing with a different kind of Ontario from the sort of Ontario that Leslie Frost had dealt with. And the population was growing rapidly, very rapid urbanization. The legislature is becoming more professionalized. Under Frost, the legislature met for about 3 months in the year, and the members didn't have offices in the Queen's Park, whereas all that changed with Robarts' time, and he was a much more sophisticated management-oriented type person. So the point I'm making here is that there's quite a significant difference that was occurring at the time that Welsh began serving in the legislature. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, I mentioned that Frost had this Red Tory agenda, and I'm sure Frost never used the word Red Tory. It's something that has been applied later. And Charles Taylor, the Canadian political philosopher, said a Red Tory is a conservative with a conscience, that a Red Tory respects tradition and order, but they're also concerned about things like social justice, and they're willing to use public power to curtail private greed. And I think the idea is that a traditional conservative would see government in a very minimalist way, doing as little as possible and so forth, whereas a Red Tory would see that government, that public power can be used in a positive way. And particularly it can be used to improve society by providing equality of opportunity. And to a certain extent, you could look at the idea of the Red Tory is what put the progressive in the progressive conservative party. There's also a bit of a streak of paternalism. I'll talk about that in a minute. Give you some insights into Leslie Frost's 22 points. Leslie Frost's 22 points were very much Red Tory. They were very progressive in a lot of ways. So these first two are direct quotations. The workers and employers of this province should have the fairest and most advanced laws governing labor relations. This was a conservative. This was a conservative who was saying this. Every child in this province will have an opportunity to be educated to the full extent of their mental capacity. So, I mean, this was really about an equality of opportunity. So it was very progressive in a lot of ways in terms of the way the 22 points dealt with things like human rights and public health care. But there was also something in there that I'm going to talk about when I get back to talking about Welch. And that is that the Red Tory idea does have sort of a conservative streak in it about government knows best. And there wasn't a lot, not that there wasn't a lot, there was nothing in the 22 points about public participation, that the public might have some role in deciding what labor legislation would be, or the public might have some role in education, making decisions about education and so forth. That was the one aspect of what I called on that previous slide, the sort of paternalistic aspect of the Red Tory idea. And I'm going to contrast that with Welch later. So let's go back to talking about Welch. He ran 6 times, was successful all 6 times that he ran. What you see on this table is he ran for in Lincoln and Brock ridings. There was some redistricting, so Lincoln riding kept the same name, but it was a little different over time. And the family moved to Niagara on the Lake, and so he went to a different riding at that point. What you see there is he always was at 50%, slightly under 50% of the vote. Now, remember that there were always at least 3 people running, and sometimes there were 4 or 5 people in these elections. So getting 50% or 60 or 59% is really outstanding when you're running against 4 or 5 other people. The other way that you can look at where Welch fit into the grand scheme of things is the column on the extreme right shows the percentage of the popular vote that the PC party got across the entire province. So Welch was consistently, in some cases far above 15, almost, I don't think he ever got quite 20 points, but almost 20 points better than the PCs did across the entire province. So that's the kind of domination that he had in this riding. Now, this table shows the different positions that Welch had. It's actually not complete. There's some other smaller things in there that didn't make the table. I think what I want you to get from this is that he held a number of different roles. I'm not going to go through these. I don't have time to go through these in any detail. But the point is he held a number of different roles. If you want to check the timing of that, he sometimes had at least 2 and maybe even 3 roles at the same time. One thing I do want to point out on here is if you look just beneath the halfway point there, you'll see that he was appointed deputy premier on September 21st, 1977. That's a very significant post, because what that means is that he speaks for the premier whenever the premier is not around. And that 1977 date is misleading. That's when he was formally called deputy premier. It was understood there was a kind of understanding for several years before that that he was speaking for the premier. So this is what the premier thought of Bob Welch, and besides giving him a variety of different positions, the role of deputy premier is a very, very significant position. So what did he do when he was in cabinet? What were some of the things that he did? Well, his first task, now remember, he hadn't been in the legislature very long, 3 years when he was given his first task, and that was to modernize the liquor laws. And this was, you can imagine in the 60s, this was very difficult. It was something that Robarts felt had to be done because what was happening is the hospitality industry in areas, well, like Niagara, that was a border area, or the border areas on Quebec and Michigan. It was the liquor laws in Ontario were having a significantly detrimental impact on the development of the hospitality industry in portions of Ontario. And there was also some push from the general public to have modernized liquor laws. But this wasn't easy because there were other forces that were not happy about modernizing liquor laws. So it was a real challenge for Bob Welch to work his way through the idea of modernizing liquor laws. One thing that did come out of this is he was always a strong advocate for Ontario wines throughout his career, regardless of what portfolio he held. He always commented if he couldn't find Ontario wines in the legislative cafeteria or whatever. Even though he famously didn't drink very much, I think he wanted to know that the Ontario wines were there. Another position he held was education. Now, education had been the position that both Robarts and Davis used to prepare themselves to become premier. When Welch arrived in education, it was a bit different because things like in Davis's time in particular, there were stories about because the population was increasing and the baby boomers were going to school. There were stories about Davis running all over the province. And supposedly he would sometimes open 2 or 3 schools in the same day. So Davis and Robarts got very well known when they were ministers of education across the entire province. When Welch took over, it was a different situation because they had made all these changes, and now Welch had to implement them. And they weren't always popular. They seemed like they were going to be popular when they were building all those new schools, but Welch had to sort of remind people that, well, those new schools are going to cost money, and that's going to have an impact on taxes. And not everybody liked the way the districts were consolidated and so forth. So if you see what's happening here, he was given a difficult task in terms of modernizing liquor laws. He was given a difficult task in terms of education. This became kind of Bob Welch's trademark, that he was given the difficult tasks, and he managed to handle these very difficult tasks that he was given. He also served as House Leader for an extensive period when he was in cabinet. Now, the House Leader is not a position that's known very well outside Queen's Park. It is a very important position because each party has a House Leader, and the role of the House Leader, particularly for the government party, is to plan out the government's agenda for its entire mandate, for its 4-year period or whatever, to plan that out and to try to guide the legislature so that the government accomplishes what it wants to accomplish. This requires some very skillful negotiation with the House leaders of the other parties, and it's a very important position. It's also a very difficult position, and it requires tremendous diplomatic skills to deal with the other House leaders and to prevent the government from getting off track. The other thing that Welch did was the deinstitutionalization of people with intellectual disabilities. I think this is probably the single most significant thing that he did. Prior to this idea of deinstitutionalization, people with intellectual disabilities were, I don't know what other word to use, they were warehoused. They were taken away from their families usually, and they were warehoused in large institutions someplace. The idea of the deinstitutionalization is what we now, it's now a part of our common vocabulary to talk about community living. That was not the case before Welch developed this idea of deinstitutionalization. I shouldn't have said Welch developed the idea. I mean, it was part of an international and national movement. It wasn't his idea, his initial idea, but he was really instrumental in getting this thing done and developed in Ontario. Some of my colleagues, I asked some of my colleagues at Brock, and as soon as I said the name Bob Welch, they were just all over this about the tremendous impact that he had on the way society has dealt with people with intellectual disabilities. And I can't help thinking that if you want to think back to when I was talking about Rita Boston, I can't help thinking that she probably had a bit of an impact in this. And then later on in his career, he instituted the lottery. You know, just like instituting liquor laws was, modernizing liquor laws was something that needed to be done, but it was kind of a tough slog. Lotteries were the same thing. You know, the province was probably losing a lot of money to other jurisdictions that were nearby, but lotteries were popular by some people and not so popular for others. And this is something that he had to negotiate. So his role in cabinet, just to kind of summarize this, he was given the difficult tasks. He was given the difficult task, as I identified early on, because he showed that he was very competent about handling these things. He had a very high degree of integrity. The PC dynasty was not, with a few kind of glaring exceptions, the PC dynasty was not touched by a lot of public scandal. But even compared to the others, there was no hint of any sort of scandal, any sort of lack of integrity on the part of Welch. And this is really important because when you're doing things like instituting lotteries, I don't know if you've heard about some of the scandals that have happened in some of the US states. There's a lot of money involved in giving out lotteries and gambling licenses. And it can be a real test for someone's integrity. But there was never any question about Bob Welch's integrity. He also had very solid diplomatic skills in things like being the House leader, but also in things like navigating through this idea of instituting things that were like the liquor laws and like the lottery that were popular with some people, but not with others. You know, getting this thing done was very tricky. So in 1985, what happened is that Frank Miller took over from Davis. 1985 it's going to be a tough election year with David Peterson and Bob Ray as leaders of the other parties. He had considered stepping aside in 81, but apparently people prevailed on him to kind of, do your duty sort of thing. So he did not run in 1985. After 22 years in the legislature and 19 years in cabinet, he certainly had satisfied his quota of public service at that point in terms of both quantity of the number of years and quality of what he had done. So he was, and so that's when he left Ontario politics. I want to go back to just an event in his political career that I think is worth discussing. 1971, well, in 1970, Robarts announced that he was going to step aside. So in 71, there was a convention. Bill Davis was the heir apparent. He had been Minister of Education and was well known across the province. Alan Lawrence was less experienced. He was from Toronto, and he had Norm Atkins and the Big Blue Machine working for him. So those were the two front runners. Welch and Darcy McHugh were they were in this contest, and their hope was that whichever one finished third, if Davis and Lawrence got into a deadlock, then whoever finished third could come up the middle. Well, unfortunately, Welch finished fourth by about three votes or so, but finished fourth. McHugh finished third. But that didn't matter that much anyway, because it took 4 ballots, but it wasn't going to be a deadlock. Davis was far enough ahead that he was going to win. However, what did happen at the 71 leadership convention is that this relatively unknown guy named Bob Welch gave what everybody recognized was the best speech and the most exciting speech. Remember, I said earlier that he had, consciously worked on his oratorial skills, and he said a number of pretty radical things. Supposedly, he just kind of tossed his prepared speech aside, and he said a number of pretty radical things, talking about broadening the membership of the party. There was a small number of people who felt the Conservative Party was becoming too inward looking and did not have broad roots. But this was kind of a radical and dangerous thing to be saying, apparently. But that's what he said. He said he wanted the party to have broader memberships. And he even mentioned the idea of going after people who were in unions, if you can imagine that. He presented a number of Red Tory ideas. He was always interested in environmental issues, and he talked about environmental issues on the campaign trail. Now, this is 1971. Okay, so again, this is pretty radical. I mean, now everybody has to pay some sort of lip service to the environment, but in 71, this was pretty radical. And the way he gave the speech was also looked at as just being very different and very exciting for this campaign. Remember, he was running against Bill Davis, who sort of invented the phrase "bland works," right? So Welch was delivering this very dynamic kind of speech that he did as an orator. So I want to play a little, there's this stream in literature about alternate history. So let's do a little alternate history. I'll see if you want to talk about this at the end. The Ontario dynasty, the Ontario PC dynasty, looks something like this: Drew for 6 years, Frost for 12, Robarts for 10, and then Davis for 14 before Miller took over and served a few months. So alternate history here. What would have happened if Davis decided in 1981, that was the election year, the minority government had finished, and that was the election year. What if Davis decided that instead of going again, he was going to leave after 10 years? That's respectable. Look at the other numbers. That's a respectable lane. So what would happen if Davis left in 1981 instead of staying around until 1985? Okay. Well, let's talk about Welch for a minute. Think about where Welch was in his career. He was deputy premier. He had served in a number of positions. He didn't do very well in 1971. This was 10 years later. He'd served in a variety of different positions, and he's now very well known. So, he's well known. He would have had a number of contenders. These are some of the people who were in cabinet, and you see some very well-known names there. Frank Miller, who ultimately won, Roy McMurtry, Betty Stevenson, Dennis Timbrell ran in 1985 against Frank Miller and did very well, and running against Frank Miller. So he wouldn't have been a shoe-in. There were a number of potential contenders there, but he had a good shot at it. That's pretty clear. So here's the what if. Here's the alternative history. What we know happened is that the Progressive Conservative Party after Davis became the party of Frank Miller, Mike Harris, Ernie Eves, and Doug Ford. What if it had become the Progressive Conservative Party of Bob Welch and who knows after that? Anyway, it's something to think about, in that alternative history stuff. It's an interesting thing to think about. So after his political career, he's the sort of guy who doesn't really slow down very much. So he was chancellor of Brock University for 15 years after that. That's where I got to know him quite well. He was on several corporate boards. He served on the International Joint Commission for 6 years. One of the things he was proudest of here is there was a report that came out published by the IJC that was raised very strong concerns about the quality of the environment for the Great Lakes. And he was very proud of that report, the impetus that he thought that report gave to changing environmental issues. He was on the Ontario Press Council. He was chancellor of the Anglican Diocese. He was an officer of the Order of Canada in 1994. Officer is the second rank. There are 3 ranks within the Order of Canada, and officer is the second rank, very, very exclusive. Then Rita had died in 1994, and Bob died in 2000. He had dealt with cancer for 4 years. He died when he was 72 years old, just much, much too young. And there was a significant memorial service at Brock University with about 800 people in attendance in the gym where he had presided over convocations for 15 years. So that's his life story. Let me talk about his political philosophy a bit here. And I've presaged most of this, I think. As with most practicing politicians, he was too busy doing stuff to write about things. So he didn't set down his political philosophy any place. What I've tried to do as a political scientist is I've tried to figure out, based on his actions and some of the things he's talked about, I've tried to figure out what his political philosophy was. And he was clearly adhered to the Red Tory idea of the Progressive Conservative Party, and I've talked about that. However, he did differ in one sense. You know, I talked about how the Red Tory idea has that conservative streak about paternalism. He always spoke very strongly about the need for public participation. And again, I'd emphasize this was like in the 70s, 60s, and 70s when that phrase public participation and public engagement didn't roll off the tongue nearly as easily as it does now. But it was a significant part of his political philosophy that he talked about a great deal. Related to this, the idea of public participation, he was a firm believer in education. He was on the board of education, but he saw education not just as formal stuff that goes on within the 4 walls, but he felt that everybody had to have the opportunity for personal and social development so that residents could become real citizens and understand their society and participate properly in their society. So he had these 3 things really build on one another, and they're coherent political philosophy, even though I don't think he ever said these things in so many words. And then finally, he was very concerned about environmental issues. I mean, this was another part of his political philosophy. So that's my political scientist attempt to kind of retroactively give him a political philosophy, even though he didn't enunciate these in so many words. But I think I've done him properly here in terms of putting together what his views were. His legacy. Well, we've got some physical things. The downtown courthouse in St. Catharines is the Robert S.K. Welch courthouse. That is part of his physical legacy. Welch Hall, which is the building on the Brock University campus that houses the Faculty of Education, is named after him. He played a role in ensuring that Brock would have a Faculty of Education when the teachers' colleges were being switched over into universities. He played a role in making sure that was going to work. I worked in this building for a couple of years, and I always like to walk in one particular door, and you go up a small flight of steps, and at the very top, there was a picture of Bob standing there, smiling at you as you walked up the steps. I always like to go in that door and have that experience of meeting Bob Welch first thing in the morning. Now, in terms of his political legacy, I think at the top, and I'm probably influenced by people I know in this field, the deinstitutionalization of people with intellectual disabilities was something that was very important, and it was handled quite well in his time. He was also involved in transforming the style of government. And, I talked about this at the beginning, how the style of government was changing from Frost's time to Robarts. And Robarts should get a lot of credit for that. That's justified. And Davis also carried that on. I mean, they were the leaders of this. But they couldn't have done this if they didn't have people like Bob Welch in cabinet who were able to support them in this. And Welch had this personal style of integrity and quiet competence and a focus on people that really put him in a very good position to work with Robarts and Davis in terms of getting this change. And in some ways, he was a man before his time. I don't know how many times I've talked about, he did public participation, but nobody was talking about that. He was concerned about environment, and nobody was talking. I mean, he was a man before his time. It's, I think, a good phrase for him. So that's as much as I have put together for this evening. I guess we'll have some sort of discussion. I don't know if we're going to do this verbal discussion or we're going to use chat. I'll turn it back to John or Wes to figure out the best way to do this.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Wes.
Oh, did Bob practice law at all?
Oh, yes, he did. I mean, those early years when he was on the Board of Education, certainly he practiced law at that point. And then after he finished in the legislature, I think, as we know, Wes, being chancellor of university, it's an important honorific position, but it's not really you don't make much money as the chancellor of a university. So practicing law at that point. One of his assistants said that it was really, particularly the sort of law that Bob practiced was really very important in terms of the way he viewed things. And he compared Bob to some of the cabinet ministers who were Bay Street lawyers, and they did mergers and acquisitions and international trade and all this really important stuff. Bob had to sit down with people. I think the phrase he used, they had to sit down with a grieving widow and explain to her that she was going to have to declare bankruptcy. And gave Bob understanding of the personal nature of issues and how to deal with people on issues. That the guys who did all the mergers and acquisitions and so forth were, they were, supposedly they're going to be better in their profession, but they didn't have the same kind of people skills and diplomatic skills that Bob Welch had.
Bill Stevens advises that Bob was the president of our Historical Society in 1959 up until June 1960. So there's something you may not have known.
I did not know that. No.
There we go.
That's good to know. I'm surprised nobody's picked me up on that alternative, alternate history.
Yeah. So he clearly had a lifetime of service in many ways, on the political side and church and the historical society as well. Gail has a question.
Well, it was just to follow up on what Bill Stevens just mentioned. I had no idea. Here we are with the Historical Society of St. Catharines making a presentation, and Bob Welch was one of us for a little bit of time.
Joanne.
I just wanted to say that I knew Bob for a good part of my life, originally through Grace Church. But especially I remember his kindness. My father died when I was 12. He was in his 40s at the time. And my mother was left with 3 children to raise on a very modest salary. And Bob was always very sensitive to that, as was Rita. And I really appreciated it because when Bob became a cabinet minister, he had a chauffeur. And Bob, because he was also quite frugal, decided that his chauffeur, Mr. Hawks, might be better if he just rented a room in someone's home. And so he did that. He rented a room in my mother's home. And whenever Bob was speaking late or being driven here, there, and all over the province, George Hawks was there to be available. And so it was, I think, a big help to George because he enjoyed coming to a home rather than sitting in a hotel room. But it was a big help to us as a family. But that was just maybe one small thing. I remember he was at our wedding. He was just a wonderful friend and always was sort of in touch. Is there something he could do? And so I really appreciate beyond his contribution to St. Catharines and Ontario, but I'd like to highlight him as a human being and somebody who really was out there thinking of others who sometimes misfortune happens, and he was there to give you a helping hand.
It's okay.
That's a great story. That's a personal story that, I don't think we would have heard of unless you shared that. So thanks for that, Joanne. Are there any more questions from our members? Peter.
Well, it's actually Mary Jane.
Oh, Mary Jane.
We're sharing a computer.
Sharing Peter's computer. Okay. Go ahead.
David, I was just wondering, in this day and age, would a politician like my father really survive?
Wow. I call this gentleman politician, Niagara's gentleman politician. And I originally started to write this. I was thinking about comparing the style in Bob's time with the style that exists now. It's obviously very different, isn't it, Mary Jane? And I sort of, maybe I'll do that at some future time, but I didn't really make that comparison now. Because I would have lost, I would have lost the ability to talk about Bob if I was going to talk about the difference in style. But maybe I'll write about that at some point. I guess that's kind of what I was getting at in the alternate history that we have had under Harris and Eves and Ford. We have had a particular style of government, and this is not the place to say whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, but it is different. Well, it is different
Yes.
from the style that people like Robarts and Davis and Welch have. So I don't know. The world has gone in a different direction from the way it was 30 or 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, John Stevens.
Did he fully overcome his stuttering problem?
Well, it certainly seems like it. As I say, he was when he gave that speech in 71, the newspaper, well, I remember actually, I was fairly young at the time, but I remember seeing it on television, and the way it's reported in the media, I mean, he was just really took people by surprise, and it was just seen as really a dynamic kind of speech. And I think I mentioned that other, members of the legislature who sat with him have told me, and I've seen it written, that what the legislature looks like outside of question period, right? There's just a handful of people hanging around in there. And they would say that, when we knew that Bob Welch was speaking, we made a point. We got out of our office and we went down to the legislature to hear him, just to see the way he spoke. So it sounds like he did a pretty good job of overcoming his speech impediment. And I think it says something about the man, doesn't it? When instead of letting, I think a lot of people would have let an impediment like that get them down. He took the opposite approach to the thing and just met it head on, and that was that. Did I see Rob Welch's hand up?
It was.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that, and he did, but when he got tired, John, he would sometimes slur his S's. That was a bit of a hang up that he kept until he died. And actually, when my sisters and I were cleaning out his apartment, I opened up his briefcase, and at the bottom of his briefcase was a pamphlet for an organization called Speak Easy. And remember, he died in 2000. So this organization called Speak Easy was to support people and research into speech impediments. And he was a contributor to that organization. So David's right. He beat the impediment, but when he was tired, and at some point there would be the occasional slur of his S's. That was the only remnant that at least I remember. Thank you.
Thanks.
Looks like that's it. Last call for questions. There's nothing in the chat, nothing further in the chat.
Right. Maybe it's time for me to say something.
Yeah, Gail.
Okay. I really only wrote something on a scratch pad today. I want to thank Dave Siegel so much for a really fantastic presentation. I had heard, of course, of Bob Welch, and my husband knew him as well, but I was so impressed with the generosity of the man. I didn't know about how civilized he was. And to answer Mary Jane's question, I think there is been nothing like the gentleman that he was. I mean, as you said, a man of his time or before his time, and politics has certainly declined greatly with the loss of Bob Welch. He was truly the last gentlemanly politician that I have ever heard of, and his interest in social causes and social justice, along with his wife, is just that is truly a legacy. And thank you for bringing that all towards to us tonight. I can't thank you enough. A lot of people have worked hard on this presentation, and I'm so glad to see his family there. And thank you all again.
And thank you, Gail, for the for your formal thank you to our speaker. Thanks to all of those of you who have attended, and we look forward to seeing you all again, perhaps 4 weeks from tonight, when on Thursday, June the 22nd, our speaker will be retired Brock University professor Joan Nix, talking about on the topic of images and stories of leisure and community in Niagara Falls past. So we look forward to seeing you at that time. And for now, good night.
Good night, all.
Night all. Good Good night.